Hello, this is Ian Williams. I'm the president of the Foreign Press Association and a sort of an avid reader, amongst other things. And I collect anomalies. And Jonn Elledge has just written a book which collects geopolitical anomalies in a distinctive way. And I found it a lot. It's very sympathetic. At the United Nations, I was the correspondent for, amongst other things, Pacific Islands Monthly. So I was the specialist in microstates. People used to come along and say, does this country really exist? And rely upon me to assure that the postage stamp countries in every sense, because they were small as postage stamps. And some of them in those days, their main income was from sale of postage stamps, a sort of truncated form of sovereignty. So
Well, today, of course, there's Tuvalu, which makes a lot of its money by selling .tv internet domains, doesn't it? So
yes, oh,
it's still very much going on. The idea of like making small states making their money in odd ways.
well, a lot of them run shipping registries as well, even though they don't have much of a navy to call on if you're attacked by pirates anywhere. So it's but I mean the other part we're looking at here, which you examine, is the anomalous nature of boundaries, of borders. How real are they? I mean, we have the border between the US and Canada, which has wobbled because it has another of our members that wrote a book, Lines in the Sand. And I noticed some of the things you didn't mention, or maybe I'm getting the horse before the cart before the horse, but you didn't consider the Kuwait-Iraq border, which I was watching, which was a classic line in the sand.
Oh, there are so many borders, aren't there? I mean, like I could quite easily. So the book is called A Brief History of the World in 47 Borders.
And the publisher
In
is,
The Experiment. These are the American editions. The
yeah.
British one's got a slightly different name and so on. But I mean, the chapter, the title in itself is a bit of a lie because it's not really 47 borders, it's 47 chapters. Some of them contain several borders, some of them are more kind of conceptual rather than exploring particular lines. And the British paperback, which came out in April, actually made the title even more of a lie by adding a 48th chapter. So really, at this point, no part of the title remains accurate. But
Which makes it like a boundary in itself.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a border in itself.
It's very fitting, but I could quite easily have done far more. And if it did well enough, I would not be averse to kind of writing a fairly direct sequel. Because I still have a huge spreadsheet somewhere of lists of interesting borders with interesting stories attached, borders that are kind of, as you say, anomalous or have particularly interesting histories or tell us something about geopolitics and national identities and so on. To some extent, the fact it's 47 just marks the point at which I ran out of time to write and space in the book, rather than my claiming it's any definitive statement on which are actually
Some of the boundaries you describe, it's because the surveyors got bored and ran out of time or patience and packed up and went home, leaving leaving a meridian or a longitude sign to fill in the gaps, didn't
Well,
they?
quite frequently. One of the stories I always knew I wanted to include in the book, because it was in a BBC documentary series called Tales from the Map Room, which my late grandfather Walter Horsey recorded for me on his VCR in about 1993. And that was kind of a huge influence on shaping my brain. The story in question was that of the Sudan-Uganda Border Commission of 1913. In which two British Army officers, each with a troop of locals backing them up, are sent off to survey this border, what was at that point an internal border between two different bits of the British Empire. And one of them, I can never remember which way round it is, but one of them wanted to do he was filled with noblesse oblige. He wanted to do right by the locals. He wanted to make sure he was mapping exact kind of like tribal boundaries and kind of, who grazes their sheep here and who sort of raises their crops here and so on. And the other guy just really wanted to go home. He'd been in Africa far too long. He was sick of this hot country. He wanted to go on leave, and this job was in his way. So we have extensive diaries kind of documenting the slow motion collapse of their relationship over a period of about 2 or 3 months and 400 miles until eventually the latter of them just gets so pissed off he goes home. And the other one kind of struggles on for another 50 miles or something. But by that point, his team are all exhausted. The kind of camels and the mules are starting to die of sleeping sickness. And so he never finishes the job. So about still several hundred miles from I think it's the Red Sea, he just gives up. And the last few hundred, forgive me, the last few hundred miles of that border, he just decreed would be a straight line on the map. And that is still there on the map of Africa to this day. There is still this boundary that, if you look at it, it starts off as kind of very detailed and becomes gradually more sweeping. And then the last few hundred miles, it is just a straight line. And for no better reason than the Brits, who were kind of sent out to survey it 112 years ago, were just too tired to do anything better. And it's an international boundary now, and that is mad to me. But that is how geopolitics works.
But you mentioned, I mean, the so-called scramble for Africa was many of the boundaries there make no ethnographic or geographical sense. It was because it was at the Congress of Berlin where people were drawing lines on maps saying, well, I'll have that if you have this. No one had ever been there. And many of the one of the founding principles of the African Union is the colonial boundaries are sacrosanct, which is a fairly dangerous principle because they don't make much sense most of the time, linguistically, ethnically, even religiously.
Well, I mean, institutions tend to pursue their own interests, don't they? And the interests of an institution are not necessarily the same as the interests of the people that institution contains. And nation states are no different from businesses or the Britain's National Health Service or whatever else you kind of want to point to. These things, like these organizations, always have these institutional interests, and so like even if the people of what is now, I don't know enough about African politics to pick a good example, but for the sake of argument, let's say Nigeria is a country where there's obviously quite substantial differences between the north and the south. The interests of the people who live in Nigeria, they may sort of have a different conception of who they are and who they have commonalities with than the interests of the nation itself and the people of its capital would wish them to. But because the money is in the capital, because there are government bodies, they will be wanting to maintain the nation state of Nigeria as it currently exists. And this is why you often end up with, not just in Africa, obviously, there is always, wherever you are in the world, there are often these kind of tensions between the metropole, as it were, and the provinces. And the results of the scramble for Africa are one of the more extreme examples of that, because they're entirely imposed by external forces around a conference table thousands upon thousands of miles to the north in Berlin. It's a bunch of white people sat around the table carving up a continent and handing bits of it to each other. But I think you can see the same kind of thing playing out in countries a very long way from Africa as well.
The former Soviet Union is a case in point where
Well,
Stalin
quite, yes.
puckishly drew up boundaries that I think, if we assume the word, he had because he was the ethnicity expert for the Bolsheviks, he thought he had particular expertise, or he was deliberately sowing traps to make sure that none of them could ever have a peaceful life afterwards, as in Ukraine or Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, where, the boundaries were just vodka infused. Sometimes it would appear.
Well, we're seeing this play out in that part of the world right now, aren't we? Where like some of the boundaries of Ukraine were determined by internal Soviet politics in the 20th century. But that to me seems to matter a lot less than the basic fact that the people of Ukraine do not wish to be Russian. That's overwhelms everything else. So I tried quite hard to get myself in trouble earlier this year by writing a column in the New Statesman under a headline along the lines of, Donald Trump is not entirely wrong about the border of Canada and the US. because he was making those statements basically saying, look at this ridiculous straight line. That's obviously a made up boundary. And, insofar as it goes, that's true. That was the long straight line along it's the 49th, isn't it? The 49th parallel for a couple of thousand miles was drawn up between two sets of white people of European descent through territory they had not necessarily surveyed, saying, okay, we'll have this bit and you'll have that bit. And that is the exact same process that we saw in the Scramble for Africa, and you see in former colonial territories around the world. And that is why it is a long straight line, because it was not drawn up by surveying the landscape, it was drawn up around the conference table for political reasons. Donald
And
Trump was
certainly not
entirely
by
right about the fact
consulting
that
the
this border
locals.
was manufactured.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But where the logic falls down is where Donald Trump is wrong, that doesn't make it legitimate today because, well, it doesn't make it unusual for all the reasons I just said. This happens rather a lot. And it doesn't make it illegitimate because the key point is that the people on the two sides of that line consider themselves to have two different identities. And the ones he was talking about basically swallowing up absolutely do not want to be American. And that
That's a
seems to
classic
override
case.
everything else.
That's a classic case of where a sort of theoretical boundary has got practical results, because south of that boundary, you've got the National Health Service, massive gunshot wounds and murder rates. North of it, you have a relatively urbane and sophisticated politic with a National Health Service, low murder rates, and a sort of calm and equitable politics. And that's a boundary that sort of, as you were suggesting before, it became real.
No, I mean, nations also generate their own. So one of the sorry, I'm going to back up a bit. One of the questions I try to answer in the book, but in that sort of way where you're not going to really be able to answer it, but you're kind of trying to sort of talk around it. One of the questions I discuss in the book was like, do boundaries shape national identities, or do national identities shape boundaries? And obviously, it's actually a two-way process. So if you, so like for kind of contradicting what I said about Africa earlier, because I don't really know that much about Africa, I'm honest. But although there will be people at sort of the edges of countries like Nigeria who maybe would feel happier if they were in
Check the
a polity
Cameroons.
with
Check the Cameroons for your
yeah.
next book.
Okay, but I mean, there is a piece of
The Cameroons is divided. It was a German colony, and now it's divided between the people who were briefly under English language control with Nigeria and the people who are under French control. And that's
well,
the big fault line in the country,
this
regardless of the
happens
fact the
rather a
originals were the
lot.
Germans.
So in the book, I also talk in the Scramble for Africa chapter about this piece of research by some academics at the London School of Economics, where they kind of mapped best they could. They mapped the kind of ethnic, tribal, national, however you want to describe it, boundaries in Africa on the eve of the Berlin Conference. And then over the top of them, they did national boundaries and where there has been civil conflict. And what they found is that there has been a disproportionate amount of conflict in areas where the existing territories where people might have shared an identity ended up divided between two or more states, because you have national capitals that say, well, this bit of land belongs to us. And people find themselves divided from those that they think they have a far closer relationship to than they do with those, who are ostensibly their countrymen. But against that logic, you do also see, the existence of a nation state, or any polity really, kind of generates its own identity over time. So the counterexample I often think about is if you kind of look at them, if you look at what we now think of as Austria in, I don't know, 1800, it is just part of Germany, because there is no Germany politically. There's this patchwork of states, of which Austria is kind of the largest, most powerful fragment. It also has its own empire of non-German speakers. But that's kind of the situation in 1800. By 1900, there very clearly is an Austria with its own identity, because it had been kept out of the unification of Germany. And obviously you have Anschluss under the Nazis, where it's kind of pulled into the German territories and then pulled out again after the Nazis lose. And now it's sort of inconceivable that Austria could just be an area of Germany. It's clearly something different because it has such a different history. but that is a result of the last 200 years of political history rather than anything kind of inherent to those two sets of people. It is entirely possible to imagine a different timeline in which Germany never came into being in the sense it has now, or in which Austria is part of it. You know, these things are entirely contingent. In the same way, it's possible to imagine a unified English-speaking North America had politics gone differently, but it didn't go differently. So we've ended up with the superpower south of the 49th parallel and the much smaller, more liberal territory to its north.
One one of the examples, of course, calls into question the whole issue of boundaries was the European Union of saintly memory. You know, I remember traveling through, and
I
I was
think it's
almost
still going. It's just they don't let us in anymore. It
yeah.
does. It's still very much alive and well.
Well, I'm thinking of it in terms of when I used to travel there as a kid, especially. I was almost disappointed they never stamped my passport, and I like collecting foreign stamps on my passport. But they never bothered because they just waved you through. It was less fuss than a county boundary or a civic boundary in
Mm.
Britain. Um, and you just went through with no difficulties. And that was a very happy state to be in, I think. You could travel from the Sahara to the Arctic, almost to the North Pole, without a passport or being checked in any way. And you know, with lots of restrictions, you could just camp and say, "I'm going to live here," without any difficulties. And then they were
Well,
the ideal boundaries for me. It was a sort of administrative convenience. It's when they become
well,
real and bristling with weapons that they really pose problems.
yeah. I mean, like I suspect we agree on the matter of Brexit and whether or not it was a good idea, or indeed
An
about the most
unmitigated
stupid thing. This,
disaster.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's been a complete and total. I don't know if I can swear in this podcast. So I'm going to stop there. But it's been very very bad, and it was always going to be very very bad. And I miss my maroon passport, and I miss being a European. Uh, but we are where we are, and it is worth remembering that kind of the sort of corollary of the kind of free move within Europe has been tightening the restrictions between Europe and everywhere else. So like because people are free, because there are no border checks between uh, Italy and France, say, that does kind of require Italy to have tighter border checks on those coming in from the Mediterranean. So there is kind of a connection between uh, free movement within Europe and the sense of fortress Europe. Britain has really stuffed itself here because we've kind of now got the worst of both worlds, where we don't have free movement in Europe, but we've also kind of given ourselves what is basically a border crisis on our southern border through the English Channel, because until we left the European Union, we were part of not only part of the EU but part of the Dublin Convention, which was the set of rules that when migrants and asylum seekers arrive in Europe, wherever they end up, they can be returned to their first country of origin, and it's their job to deal with them, which is terribly unfair on the Italians and the Greeks particularly, because it means so many of the people who are arriving in Europe from Africa or the Arab world kind of end up there first. But it did mean that like Britain did not have to deal with a lot of this, because a lot of we could just return people to the country of origin, or country of first arrival rather. One of the side effects of Brexit has been that we now have what's being referred to as the small boats crisis in the Channel, where we can no longer do that. And I don't know what the numbers are now. They are high. They're still small in the context of overall migration, let alone the population as a whole. The crisis is to some extent confected, but nonetheless, it's not a good visual for a
Well,
politician
that's
trying
the
to claim
point.
they're in
I think
control of the
that's the point
borders.
you're making is that borders can produce geopolitical effects, especially in
Absolutely.
domestic politics, way beyond the actual economic and financial significance.
Well, I think a lot of the people who voted for Brexit as well didn't realise that they were essentially kind of creating a sort of northern border for Europe again in the English Channel, which these people coming from afar would have just crossed, and so would no longer be Europe's problem. They become Britain's problem. Again,
From
problem is a
across the
very loaded
Atlantic,
term, but as they're seen. Yeah.
from here across the Atlantic, I must confess to a certain amount of Schadenfreude that many of the people most affected by this are British, are little Englanders who are living in Marbella in Spain. And complaining that they voted for Brexit and now they have difficulties getting across.
I
They,
know,
they
it's
come back to
terrible,
England to
isn't
say
it?
that people should speak English and then go back to Spain and refuse to speak Spanish.
Mhm. But yeah, no. Brits abroad are never immigrants, are they? They're expats. But and so I think it has been a shock to the system for some people to discover that they still are very much immigrants, actually.
Well, without being too Anglo-centric, the other anomaly here is, of course, the multiple boundaries or the mixed significance of the boundaries in Ireland. Um,
Mm.
I remember, what, 25 years ago, I think it was, Clinton had appointed an ambassador to Ireland who was a crusty old Irish American who was still living in the days of 1916. And he was really amazed when the British ambassador to the UN said, "But we don't have a boundary," which was true at the time. And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, any Irish person can move to Britain whenever they want.
Mm.
They can cross the border freely. They can live in
That's
Britain if they want. They can run for parliament in Britain if they want."
mm.
So, but the American ambassador to Ireland had the sort of visions of an iron curtain with, with black and tans on one side and the IRA on the other.
Well, there was always so there was a period between the period of the Troubles from the late 1960s to the late 19 to the mid 1990s, really. Um, and every time I say it, the Troubles is such a glorious euphemism, isn't it? Like we kind of, we're so used to it on this side of the Atlantic that it's easy to forget that it's a very strange word to kind of use to describe what was essentially a civil war, but that we do call it the Troubles. Um, During that period, the sort of border on the island of Ireland between Northern Ireland and the Republic was to a greater or lesser extent defended and militarized because it was partly for security reasons and partly because it was a target. One of the things that membership of the European Union for both Britain and Ireland did was it enabled, because we were essentially part of the same much bigger thing, it kind of enabled the people of Northern Ireland to pretend to imagine themselves either British or Irish as they preferred, rather than kind of being committed to a single identity that may not have been the one they
Which
wanted.
is really the
And that
optional
enabled the
position.
Good Friday Peace Agreement. And so one of the other side effects of Brexit was to undermine that agreement. A lot of work has gone into trying to make sure that doesn't happen, but it was a fairly close run thing.
But that you've touching there upon one of the consequences of boundaries is its effect on citizenship,
Hmm.
which is very potent in the US now because of the Trumpian disclaimers about birthright citizenship. So the first time you can be born in the boundaries of the United States, and if Trump has his way and his Secretary of State has their way, you need not necessarily be a US citizen and you can be deported because being born there gives you no particular locus. I understand that other countries, I think Britain is now has moved along those lines, and some other European countries have dissociated place of birth from citizenship, which in a sense puts a loyalty test on it.
I'm not sure of the situation in because I'm not sure we ever had birthright citizenship in that exact way in the first place. Different countries work in different ways.
Well, at one
There
point,
is
remember, anyone born in the British Empire had
well,
the
this is
rights
this
to
is
exist, never
this
mind
is what I
being
was
born
going
in
to come
Britain.
on to. So, like a lot of there was a scandal in Britain a few years ago, the Windrush scandal, which relates to the Windrush was well, it's originally a river, but it was the name of the HMS Windrush,
No,
which
SS,
sorry,
nothing
the
with HMS.
yes, yeah, apologies, you're quite right. The SS Windrush was a ship which brought thousands of Caribbean migrants to Britain in 1948, I think, to fill jobs that needed filling after the war, and it's seen as the symbolic start of modern multicultural Britain. Like we have there is a line on the London Transport Network that is now the Windrush line, named after that, and it was only a few hundred, maybe a couple of thousand people on that, but it is kind of seen as this symbolic moment. Those people did not come to Britain as foreigners. They came as British citizens, as people of the British Empire who had British citizenship, same as they would have had if they'd been born on this island. They came as British citizenships to work to kind of help fill labour vacancies in the mother country. The scandal a few years ago came about because Britain's delightful Interior Department, the Home Office, managed to lose some paperwork and tried to deport some of these people who not only had the right to be in Britain, having been in Britain as legal immigrants for 50 years, they came as British citizens, and because the Home Office had lost their paperwork, there were attempts to deport them. It's an absolute scandal. But
Well
now,
done,
because of
Britain. You've set the example for ICE and
and
Rubio and
now
the Americans.
this is the direction British politics. It's absolutely terrifying turn British politics has taken at the moment, because Nigel Farage's Reform Party is currently leading the polls, looks set to win the next election, and so all the other parties not all the other parties, that's not fair. The two historic parties of government seem to be under the impression that the way of countering the rise of the far right is to be more far right themselves. It's absolutely it's so depressing, but it's not just Britain. It's a global trend. We're seeing it in a lot of countries, aren't we?
Yeah, let's look at some other parts of the
Yes.
world.
Can we talk about something cheerier, please?
Well, I'm not sure it's any cheerier, but you mentioned the boundaries of China and India, and one of the things, I don't think you mentioned it in the book, but I remember at the time of the first Sino-Indian War, the the cause of the war was the fact the Indians discovered on a map published in China that the Chinese had built a road through what the Indians were claiming was Indian territory. So you raise the interesting question, if it's Indian territory, how come you didn't notice the Chinese building a highway through it across the Himalayas? What does a boundary mean under those circumstances?
Well, this is one of the running themes of the book, really, is that we sort of project the idea of the nation state much further back into history than it actually goes a lot of the time. And like at the moment, we kind of the starting point for the book is the observation that if you put the phrase "map of the world" into a search engine, you will almost certainly be presented with a political map of the world. You would be presented with a map of the 194-ish countries.
It'll show the boundary between Argentina and Chile, but it won't show the Alps, the Andes.
Exactly that. It just the internet will assume that what you're looking for is a map of nation states, and that's probably because well, you are likely to be. That is the most likely thing you are to. So it takes a moment to kind of sit back and realize that is an assumption, and these things are made up. They are concepts. And for most of human history, the world didn't work like that. So if you go back to it's still true well into the Middle Ages and beyond. But if you go back to ancient times, particularly, it is probably more accurate to imagine a sort of center and periphery model. So if you think of like the Great Wall of China, or a much smaller version of a similar thing, Hadrian's Wall, which cuts across the north of England, that sort of marked the limits of the Roman Empire. I'd grown up imagining these things were kind of imperial boundaries, and it turns out they're not really. They're kind of like they're partly defense structures, they're partly communications arteries, they're partly sort of like
Customs barriers.
Customs barriers. Also attempts to kind of demonstrate power by laying, look upon my works ye mighty, almost. But what they never were kind of hard borders in the sense that we have today, because that just wasn't how power worked. More likely, most strong polities had kind of like diminishing, concentric circles through which control diminished the further you got from the capital. So by the time you got to, northwestern China or the north of the province of Britannia, you had relatively weak imperial control, and it wasn't simply kind of a hard boundary between this is the empire and this isn't. So we sort of have this, we project back this idea of nation states much further than it actually goes. We kind of imagine that, historically, you do get this on the internet. If you get these kind of videos showing like, changing national boundaries in the 11th century or whatever, and they're entirely made up because that simply wasn't how power worked. But even today, in the age of, cars and railways and satellite photography. Um, Countries do not necessarily have full control over the entire territory which they claim because you simply don't have eyes on the whole thing the whole time. So it is entirely possible in those kind of more peripheral and frankly more difficult to access regions for another country to kind of conduct military operations without you even noticing.
Well, one of the I don't think you use my term for it. I called them stationary tourists. The people who stayed in one place and they didn't visit countries.
Mm.
Countries visited them as the boundaries washed to and fro. You know, in Middle Europe especially, there were people who alternative Russian, Polish, Austro-Hungarian, Germany, as the boundaries wafted to and fro, and mostly no one ever asked them one way or the other, which is almost what we're getting now in that part of the world.
Well, I mean, if you were born in what's the capital of Bangladesh? It's Dhaka, isn't it?
Yes, I believe so.
Yes. Okay. Right. I'm going to start that sentence again. Well, I mean, if you were born in Dhaka in Bangladesh in the mid 1940s, you would have been born as both a British citizen. You would have been born a British Indian citizen. You would have then become Pakistani, and you would then become Bangladeshi, and you could do all that without moving. There's so many examples of places like this around the world. And as you mentioned, Eastern Europe, there are lots of them. My friend Lewis Baston also wrote a book called Borderlines, which came out about 4 months after my own, which is much more focused on recent European history. But unlike me, he's actually done a lot of the sort of visiting of these places. He has the observation that, in many, there are people for whom, national history, local history, and family history simply do not align. And that you can be like a citizen of Ukraine but can have been in a city that's kind of been passed around multiple countries, and your family can see itself as something else again. It's just these identities are often a lot more complex than we may imagine in either relatively new and straightforward nations like the US or come to that islands like the United Kingdom.
Well, one of the reasons I invited you to the show is because partly because you're mirroring my obsessions, and one of the things I wrote about nationalism, which was the Procrustean approach. If you remember in the Greek myths, Procrustes invited travelers in and to sleep in his bed, and if they were too long, he chopped their feet off, and if they were too short, he stretched them. And it struck me this Procrustean approach to geopolitical boundaries has been far too prevalent. If you've got people who are inconveniently Poles in Germany, then you throw them out. If you've
Mm.
got people who, or you fill the gaps by exporting Germans into the gaps, or in case of Königsberg, which you mentioned, you send Russians there to fill the gap. So
Well,
this Procrustean approach, where
Königsberg.
you stretch and hack people to fit your concept of a national boundary, it's
Mm.
had drastic consequences over the last century.
Yeah, I mean, national identities are to some extent fictions. I mean, a lot of them are sort of manufactured in the 19th century, aren't they? There is that period especially from the well, it's the arrival of the railways to a great extent, because if you think about the world before the railways, it doesn't really matter that there are people 300 miles away speaking roughly your language and answering to probably the same king. You don't feel any particular kinship with them because they're 300 miles away. You're never going to go there. You're never going to meet them. But suddenly, like once the railways bring sort of travel at relatively modern speeds, that firstly means the people in the national capital have a much greater ability to project force. So they can kind of like stop people from stepping out of line or not following this national identity enough. But it also invents modern media to some extent, because suddenly you can have national newspapers printed in the capital and distributed overnight. So you get the same news, you get the same national debate. That's just not really true before about 1840. So yeah, like these things are have all been manufactured, and then well, not all of them. A lot of these things have been manufactured, and yet they do become this incredibly potent force in world politics over and over again. So that's the motor of a lot of the chaos in the mid 19th
I've
century.
I've I've argued with Chinese colleagues from Xinhua, for example, when they talk about the inalienable Chinese boundaries, and I point out that actually Britain has a better claim on their standards to Ireland than they have to Taiwan. I mean,
Mm.
there's a very brief period of rule from mainland China indirectly in Taiwan, and whereas we've got 8 centuries, and the other Chinese expression is as close as lips and teeth. Well, does Britain reassert sovereignty over Australia or New Zealand because they're historically part and they speak the same language? So just transferring the terms of the equation often disproves them. But of
Well,
course, if you're head of a country with 1,300 million people and nuclear weapons, then you can say yeah, boo sucks all you like, but it's going to have more weight.
yes. I mean, for the last 8 decades, we've had a world that maintained a comforting fiction that national sovereignty was the most important thing, that there were these things called nation states and they had the perfect right to be whatever they wanted, basically, and not to be pushed around by larger powers. That was never entirely true, if we're honest with ourselves. But nonetheless, like, even the big countries would kind of pretend
Well, you
there were
mentioned
sets of
Tuvalu.
rules.
Tuvalu has the same voting power in the UN General Assembly as China and India.
Yeah, which in the same way that Wyoming has the same number of senators as California, these things are often constructed for the protection of the smaller members. But it does kind of terrify me slightly that we do seem to be moving back into the world, back into the system of raw power politics, which did, for most of human history, to be fair, that was the way these things worked. But we do seem to be, Putin and Trump and Xi and God knows who else. There are a lot of these people in positions of power who do just think kind of raw ability to project force matters far more than quaint things like national sovereignty or self-determination. On China specifically, though, one of the chapters I wrote for the book, but that got cut for space reasons, which you can find on my Substack newsletter, the newsletter of Not Quite Everything, was actually about the origins of the term the Midwest, and the parallels I spotted between the Midwest and central China and central Russia, none of which are remotely where the name would suggest. And in all three cases, it's because you have basically contiguous land empires that never fell. And I think, like, what is now Western China was just imperial. Xinjiang and Tibet are basically just imperial territories that they conquered, and just
That didn't have the
remained.
decency to be separated by ocean.
Yes, exactly. But in the same way, like, the very first chapter I wrote for the book, the one that went in with the samples to my publisher.
You've gone quiet.
Oh, can you hear me now? Anything?
You you've gone silent. I don't know.
How's that? Am I back?
Yeah, I can still hear you on my end.
I can't. Okay, if you could start
Hello,
again.
can you say anything?
Yes,
Am I
now I
back?
can. Yes, yes.
Okay. The very first chapter I wrote for the book, the one that went into my publisher as a sample of, like, showing what the book would be, was the one about the US-Mexican War of the 1860s, because I feel like it's an under-discussed fact that much of the western third of the United States was conquered by the US from Mexico in what looks a lot like an imperialist expansion. Like, it is not conceived of as such, but nonetheless, everything from sort of Colorado westwards was northern Mexico, and was basically just stolen from another country for reasons of national expansion. And in the same way as, Western China and Eastern Russia, it's never been allowed out again.
Well, you mentioned you discussed. I looked some research into Texas, which left Mexico because Mexico had inconveniently took the Declaration of Independence seriously and said that slavery was outlawed.
And yeah,
And,
there's a
all of
load
the
of
Anglo settlers who'd moved in there weren't going to have Mexicans telling them to free their slaves.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really upsetting actually the number of stories, the number of border stories in the US that turn out to be about people who really, really wanted to keep slaves. It's genuinely quite upsetting. But yeah, so there's a bunch of Anglo settlers moved to Texas. Uh, with kind of a fairly explicit idea of kind of making it inevitable that it's going, repopulating it, making it inevitable that it's going to be pulled into the United States. So it declares independence from Mexico and is for a period an independent state. It's the only one of the US states that was ever a nation in its own right. But it was only ever really intended to be temporary. That was always a stepping stone towards being part of the United States.
I read the
And
memoirs of the British consul to Texas, and he was charged with keeping them out just to weaken America.
that's fascinating because at the same time, like one of the reasons, the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which determines the boundary between the newborn United States and what was then British North America and is now Canada, actually takes quite a generous approach in terms of giving the US quite a lot of territory that it had no, the settlers of the 13 colonies had never set foot in this place. The British could have used their relative power and sort of tried to maintain their hold on it. And they didn't do that in large part because it was decided by the British that it would be good to have a prosperous United States to trade with. Because almost everything the British Empire does ever is actually about making money rather than about raw power politics in its kind of purest form. It's always about business opportunities. And this was exactly the same. So it's kind of fascinating to hear that, like, just as there's sort of, well, I suppose it was a few decades later, but roughly the time they were strengthening the US on its northern border, they were trying to weaken it on its southern one.
Yes. Well, it's also worth remembering that most of the US military exercises in the 1930s were predicated on an invasion of Canada, not fighting off the Third Reich and the Japanese. Some of these scores run deep in the body politic.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's sort of weird to sort of think of that now, but in the 1930s, it was possibly not well, it was not entirely clear at that point quite what Nazism was. And it's, I mean, like, we knew it was pretty bloody horrible, but like, people had not necessarily realized the extent of the genocidal death camps, for example.
Well, they
Um,
weren't existing at
well,
the
they
time.
didn't, yeah, but also Britain was an imperial power. It was an imperial power that was in retrospect in decline, but that was not necessarily obvious at that point. And the US, for all that I just said about the actuality of how the Western states were brought in, anti-imperialism has always been quite a big part of the US psyche, right? So it's not that weird to think that the Britain and America were not necessarily natural allies just because there were family ties and a shared language. I do sometimes wonder whether we might move back into that world again. Like, I think one of the things that could push Britain closer to Europe again is the various, well, firstly, the shared interests of shared defence interests on this side of the Atlantic, not to mention shared economic interests. But also, there are actually quite sizable cultural differences. There are ways in which Britain is actually quite a European country, and America very much isn't. And I think those have been highlighted by the Trump administration. So I don't think it's impossible to imagine a future in which it's still referred to as the special relationship on this side of the Atlantic, but I think it is possible to
Never
imagine
hear
that
that
kind of
phrase in
thing.
Britain, in America.
I
Never,
can't
ever.
imagine you do. No, it's self-flattery, isn't it? It's the smaller country flattering itself. But nonetheless, I can imagine that fading over time.
Yes, well, it has faded,
Mm.
attenuated. It's like the
Mm.
Cheshire cat, the grin on the Cheshire cat. It's left after the cat's disappeared. So, what's is there a future for boundaries? I mean, are there any sort of quick and dirty solutions you can see to avoiding future boundary problems or wars over borders or
So I'm a nerd. I grew up watching a lot of 90s sci-fi, like especially Star Trek, but stuff that was kind of shaped like Star Trek. Or even this big British version, Doctor Who, like all of these things, you go into the future and there tends to be one world government. I sort of, and that's obviously because, this stuff is allegorical. But nonetheless, it meant I sort of grew up imagining that we were moving in that direction and that the European Union would be a step on that road. I no longer believe this after the last 10 years.
No. Say it ain't so.
I do not think boundaries, the concept of boundaries is going anywhere. I think they're going to remain. They've always been there. They will probably always be there. However, I don't think that means they have to be a source of conflict. So one of the more positive stories in the book is that of the town of Bala, which is actually two towns. It's mostly in the southern Netherlands, but there's various packages of northern Belgium within it. It's it looks like it's a shattered plate, bits of Belgian territory inside the Netherlands. And I think there's at least one bit where it's some more Netherlands inside Belgium inside the and all this relates to the failure to clear up various odd boundaries left over from the Holy Roman Empire in like the 12th century or something. And it's just there have been attempts to clean some of them up through land swaps and so on, but mostly it remains. In this town, different buildings are in different countries. You can literally switch which country your house is in by moving the front door. So there is rumored to be a hotel room where you can sleep in, one of you can be sleeping in Belgium while your partner on the other side of the bed is in the Netherlands. And they make a lot of money through tourism, through people coming to check out this freak boundary. But it works. It works very well because the two countries, even though they have two sets of laws, two sets of political institutions, two police forces, two schooling systems, they're very close allies, and it's treated as an administrative boundary rather than a potential site of conflict.
When I was a kid growing up on the outskirts of Liverpool, the sort of municipal boundary ran through the middle of the street next to the school. And all it meant was that one side they used grey pebble dash to resurface the road, and the other they used a particularly peculiar pink.
Well, actually,
so the boundary was totally meaningless, except the road repair trucks from one side stopped, and the other started with a different colour.
One of the more ridiculous of the origin stories for my interest in boundaries was when I was on a very long walk in the northeastern outskirts of London, in the Epping Forest area, and I just walked past some street signs announcing that I was leaving Greater London and entering the county of Essex. And you could tell because, the road had clearly been tarmacked to two different schedules. The street signs were different colours and stuff like that. And I realised the boundary ran through a pair of semi-detached houses, such that one of these houses was in London and the other one wasn't. And they shared a party wall, but they were in, one of them was in a great walled city and the other was completely outside it. And that just struck me as completely insane. But, if you envision the model for boundaries as this administrative affair, basically who you're paying taxes to and who's collecting your bins, it's a very different conception of boundaries than the one where it's this is the source of your entire identity and the flag which we will expect your children to fight and die for. So I don't think we're going to get rid of boundaries or what they represent, but I think in the best case scenario, we could steer things towards the version where nation states are represented by sports teams and patriotism rather than the one where it's military force and nationalism. It doesn't feel like we're moving in that direction at the moment, but that feels like the best case scenario to me.
Okay, well, we're running out of time now, but there's lots of other things I'd like to talk about. Gibraltar and Ceuta and Melilla, for example. Not to mention the Falklands and the fun stuff in the Caribbean and Latin America.
Well, the Falklands are an interesting. Sorry, I'm interrupting just as you're trying to wrap up, but the Falklands are an interesting one because I think a lot of people's instinctive sympathy, for very good reasons, is towards the plucky Argentinians who want the Malvinas back and against the sort of wicked British imperialists. And the slight problems there are that Argentina never had the Malvinas. They're quite a long way from the Malvinas. The Argentinians have never populated the Malvinas, and almost everybody on the Falkland Islands consider themselves British and want to remain so. And just because it's a set of islands thousands and thousands of miles from Britain, in an ocean and in the South Atlantic Ocean, I think a lot of people would imagine that this was somehow the British stole them from Argentina, and it's simply not true.
Well, that brings in the other angle that you mentioned, is that Margaret Thatcher's xenophobic attitude to national identity, she deprived the Falkland Islanders of British citizenship because the ancestors were too remote. She introduced the concept of patriality. You had to have a grandparent born in Britain to claim citizenship. So the Falkland Islanders were excluded and then sort of quietly brought back into the fold by the stroke of a pen at one point.
I'm shocked to learn that Margaret Thatcher, of all people, could ever have done anything mean-spirited.
Yes, well, in my home city in Britain, of course, they had bonfires celebrating on the occasion of of her demise, which is cruel, but it gives Charlie Kirk pause for thought. So, look, thanks very much, John. This has been fun. It's been fascinating. I hope you get lots of sales out of it. And do keep in touch. You have other ventures coming up soon. And hope that it gives the foreign correspondents in New York something to think about and write about and make money out of.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely to talk to you.